There's no real competitive advantage to my mind when I look at Gift City on the one hand and some of these other fund jurisdictions.
For Indian residents, yeah, much of a benefit. But of course, if you're a foreign resident, if you're an offshore investor, and you're investing into a fund that is set up in Gift.
All of them, or most of them, have an offshore vehicle, and most of the people I have spoken in the past, they are seriously considering an offshore vehicle in Gift City.
How do you see Gift City being a different jurisdiction as compared to what we already have?
The way we have to look at it is actually very important. We can't be comparing the regime in Gift City versus the regime in India onshore, because if you had to compare the regulatory regime with India onshore versus Gift City, then it's clear that Gift City is a far more efficient jurisdiction than what you have for domestic funds in onshore India. The real competition, Radhika, is between Gift City and the international fund jurisdictions across the world. So I'm talking about the ones we're familiar with, like Mauritius, Singapore, the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, Guernsey, Jersey. These are the jurisdictions that most of the bigger sponsors and fund houses across the world are familiar with setting up their investment funds, their flagship funds. And they make their investments out of their fund houses set up in those jurisdictions. The real test is whether Gift City can emerge into one of those international fund jurisdictions and become attractive to fund houses across the world. I know that the ambition of the government is to develop Gift City along those lines. The question is whether or not it will actually get to that position.
So you're saying it's very skeptical that how Gift City comes up in these coming years?
Actually, what I'm saying, Radhika, is that there's no real competitive advantage, to my mind at least, when I look at Gift City on the one hand and some of these other fund jurisdictions on the other hand. There's nothing that sets Gift City apart. There's nothing that makes one think or makes a sponsor feel that they ought to be setting up their funds in Gift City as opposed to any of these other jurisdictions as their base from which their funds are set up. And as long as this competitive advantage is not established in Gift City, as long as something is not done to make it super attractive for sponsors, I think you'll find that a lot of people will stick to their biases and keep setting up funds in the jurisdictions that they're already familiar with.
Is there no real commercial advantage when it comes to foreign players coming to India and setting up their bases in Gift City?
I'm talking, specifically about the foreign players who don't really have an India shop to begin with, the likes of the big sponsors who raise mega funds in Europe and in US and some other parts of the world. There needs to be some sort of a driver which tells them that, look, let's go set up our fund in Gift City because it's a super attractive fund jurisdiction. I don't currently see that. And until that emerges, I think Gift City will continue to have a market, but it will not develop into the kind of market that can attract those kind of sponsors.
What are the advantages that other jurisdictions offer that probably Gift doesn't?
It's a very good question. There are a few of those drivers. The first is, and it's quite likely for this to be forgotten, but one of the most important drivers is actually familiarity. So these jurisdictions have been established over a period of time. Not only the sponsor, but also the investors that come into those funds have become familiar with that jurisdiction and familiar with investing in that jurisdiction and putting money into those jurisdictions and then getting that money out. That's a very, very important consideration. The other is tax certainty, which is again very important. The third is the extent of regulation or the extent of the regulatory regime in those jurisdictions. Now, the world of private investment funds is largely looked upon as a light touch regime from a regulatory perspective. And therefore, a jurisdiction which offers a more flexible, a less regulated environment is one that would tend to be more preferred than a jurisdiction which is more regulated than not.
Do you have a view for Gift City being feasible for Cat 3 funds and not for Cat 1 and Cat 2 funds?
So I mean, look, the likes of EQT and CVC already take exposure to investments in India, and they structure their investments through a number of ways. And by the way, I should also mention that the government of India and the regulator in Gift City, which is the IFSCA, have been applying their minds to this project and trying to evolve regulatory regimes that are friendly to to investment funds and the participants in the investment fund industry, and that was the basis on which the draft fund management regulations came out not so recently. So if you were to look at those, the sort of regime that the IFSCA is bringing in is a lot closer to what you have in, for example, the United States in some respects than what you have in India onshore. So in that respect, it's a huge change. It's an overhaul. Does it necessarily go the distance? I think only time will tell. But there are measures that are being taken. There are probably more measures that need to be taken in order to create this competitive advantage for GIFT City and set it apart from the other international fund jurisdictions.
What is this new regulation that IFSCA has brought in which talks about fund and fund managers?
What they've done is they've changed the focus on who the regulated entity is among the various stakeholders in a fund. Under the erstwhile, and I say erstwhile a little hesitantly because it's still the current regulatory framework in GIFT City until the fund management regulations are formally introduced. But under the AIF regulations, SEBI addressed its regulatory content towards the AIF itself, i.e. the fund itself. And there were a number of obligations for the participants in the funds, for example, the sponsors, the manager, trustees, and whatnot. With the new fund management regulations, the focus point and the entity or the stakeholder on whom the regulatory content is addressed and the obligations addressed is almost exclusively the fund manager itself, as opposed to the IF. So the fund manager becomes responsible for ensuring that the fund is managed with respect to certain parameters that are set out in the fund management regulations.
Is GIFT City really beneficial for the Indian investors who want to set up their bases in GIFT and invest into India, or will it be rather considered as round tripping?
There are regulations in the GIFT City on, what an AIF or rather what a fund set up in the GIFT City can do with resident investments. The sort of prohibition against round tripping has always been that Indian money shouldn't go overseas and then come back to India. So the idea is always, you need to prevent bad money coming back into India as good money. That's the idea behind the concept, which is why I believe the regulations under the GIFT City also say that, if you're pooling money from Indian residents, you can only use that for offshore investments and you can't use that for domestic investments, which I think sort of is broadly in line with India's, FATF and AML sort of regulations, where you say that you want to try and ensure that financial proceeds are used appropriately.
Why do you think the FPI registration requirement for GIFT will be a disadvantage for foreign investors?
I think we'll have to take a look at the sources of income in each of these cases because, of course, the letter of the law is one thing, but I think the intent is very clear. The intent, I think, is very clear to avoid round tripping. So, if you have a situation where the funds are clearly and cleanly offshore funds, I think the risk should be minimal. But of course, if it turns out that the holding companies, the shareholders of the holding company are all ultimately Indian citizens who capitalized it through their Indian source income, then I believe there might be a regulatory risk there.
Why do you think should anyone go and set up their base in GIFT over other jurisdictions where especially the withholding tax is 10%, which is the same as it is in GIFT?
Historically, the attraction has always been for offshore investors to remain onshore. Offshore. What the government, I think, is now trying to do is create enough regulatory and tax incentives in India so that even though you have to pay, say, a higher withholding tax rate in some circumstances, the resulting overall flexibility that you get out of being in India, having an Indian fund manager, being able to invest in listed Indian securities, having exemptions, a 10-year tax holiday, for instance, which of course adds up to your overall cost of doing business. Those, on an overall basis, I think the idea is to sort of attract some of that foreign capital and onshore it. It's always, I think, on a case-by-case analysis that, from an investor standpoint to see ultimately what is your final, your top-line return. If the advantages of, the regulatory flexibility and everything that GIFT gives can't be beat by just being offshore, then I think the answer is quite clear that you have to be in India.
Well, there's definitely a disadvantage for Cat 1 and Cat 2 funds because they are passed through in nature. But for Cat 3 funds also there seems to be a difficulty since they only invest in listed securities.
So once you pool funds in GIFT, let's say you set up a Cat 1 or a Cat 2 AIF in GIFT, you still have to invest into India through one of the identified modes of investments. You have the FDI route, the FPI route, the FVCI route, and so on and so forth. So in each of those cases, you still have to make an application to SEBI and get that license and get that registration and only apply in accordance with the permissible instruments for each of those routes. So if you're an FPI, if you get an FPI license, you can only invest in those securities and in those sectors that FPIs are allowed to invest in. So, it's still sort of a second level of approval that you need because GIFT is considered outside India, not for tax. So, you have this hybrid sort of situation where it's considered outside India for one purpose, but it's not for another purpose. And that, I think, leads to a lot of confusion and a lot of questions from a day-to-day operational standpoint, because people just have questions, and it is still growing, is still evolving as a field. And in many cases, at least from a tax standpoint, you see these questions being answered only when, an assessment order is passed by the income tax authority, that's then taken up on appeal to a tribunal or to a high court. And it's only then that, these reported judgments actually show us in practical terms how the authorities are enforcing these regulations, because there are two competing considerations. On the one hand, you want to incentivize people to set up at the IFSC, pool capital there, attract global talent and income, etc. But on the other hand, you want to ensure that they still comply with all the regulations that Indian companies and Indian units adhere to. So you might see some friction between those two parallel competing considerations, and I think in the coming years, as cases are publicized, I think we'll see how that plays out in practice.
What if the holding company which is operating the fund in GIFT is in abroad but has subsidiaries in India? Will it then be allowed, or will it still be considered as round tripping?
The way it might work for Cat 3 funds is, I think the industry has taken a position that Cat 3 funds, because they do complex derivative trading, hedging, etc., their activities are not really investment, it's more business income. And the moment it becomes business income, it's taxed in the hands of the fund and not in the hands of the investors. That means the fund can take that 10-year tax holiday. So for a Cat 3 AIF, I think we can perhaps see some advantages to having set up in the GIFT city. There are also some other advantages in terms of capital gains from offshore derivative instruments listed on a stock exchange in the GIFT city and so on and so forth, which those instruments are still sort of becoming popular as we speak. They're not as common as direct investments into onshore Indian securities. But over time, I think we will see the Cat 3 AIF model becoming more popular in the GIFT city. But like you rightly said, for Cat 1 and Cat 2 AIFs, the advantages may not be much. The advantages are, I think, more on the fund side in terms of the flexibility that you have and not as much on the tax side.
Why did you specifically choose GIFT City as an investment destination?
The way we are trying to set up right now all the different structure is, so we are doing an India AIF, which is an onshore fund, which will be registered and operated out of India. Usually, if you look at the funds, the way they are set up is that you have an onshore vehicle and then you have an offshore vehicle. The offshore vehicle basically pulls in all the international LPs in one vehicle, and then that vehicle invests in the main vehicle, which is the onshore vehicle. In the past, we have explored other jurisdiction to register this offshore vehicle, including Singapore, Netherlands. We already have a fund out of the Netherlands. I think the main reason, why we chose GIFT over other jurisdiction, one, if you look at globally, the jurisdiction which are not seen with a lens of suspicion are very few, right? Because most of this jurisdiction came up because of the tax regulation and the transparency and the compliances. There are few who are doing a good job in terms of transparency, compliance and all, which makes those jurisdictions very expensive. So we explored Singapore in the past. Our structures in the Netherlands, they're very expensive when you compare to what you might end up spending if you have your offshore vehicle registered in the GIFT city. So one is the one-time cost, right? When you get the registration done and how much you have to pay in terms of legal and regulatory cost. The other is the operating cost, because the fund life is 10 years and every year there is some or the other requirement which needs to be complied with. And we found out that having the offshore vehicle in GIFT city also reduces significantly your long-term operating cost for the offshore vehicle. So one was cost, the other was ease, right? Because if you have something registered in a Singapore or Netherlands, it also becomes slightly difficult because then you are working with multiple partners. You have a different lawyer for the offshore vehicle and a different lawyer for the onshore vehicle. That also becomes quite easy if you have both in India, though the jurisdictions are different. In Gift City, it's more of an international jurisdiction. So there, the partners you would work with in terms of taxation, in terms of accounting, in terms of legal services, so everything becomes quite streamlined. So given these two, big factors, we decided that we go with a Gift City in terms of offshore vehicle for our fund.
Do you think that the government can do something to boost the morale of investors who are coming into the gift city?
There will be teething problem like with anything which is done for the first time, and concept came a few years ago, and a lot of changes were done by the government to make it more attractive. I think first set of early backers will have to come who set up operations there and then see what are the challenges, and then you go back to the government as a group and tell them these are the challenges we are facing. When I see the government doing something like a gift city, the intent is very clear, and I don't think they will be able to achieve the intent if the clear. And I don't think they will be able to achieve the intent if the ease of doing business and everything is not taken care of. In my understanding, they're quite open to changes in the future as well, as they have done in the past couple of years. So it's just early backers who will have to go there, face some challenges, understand what is working, what is not working, and give that feedback. I think that is also part of our job, to make us who will have to go there, face some challenges, understand what is working, what is not working, and give that feedback. I think that is also part of our job, to make things workable for the longer term. I mean, overnight nothing will become successful, but I think as of today, at least I see Gift City having enough ammunition to attract early backers. At least the funds, Indian fund managers, I think should go for it and see how it turns out.
Who can be these early backers?
I would say private sector in terms of the fund, they should be the early backers, right? Most of the Indian fund managers, if you look at, and Gift City is applicable for not just fund, but also foreign private investors, who I think would be the second step once they see the fund managers operating out of Gift City. So hedge fund managers, private equity fund managers, venture capital fund managers, who are holding an AIF license. All of them or most of them have an offshore vehicle, and most of the people I have spoken in the past, they are seriously considering an offshore vehicle in Gift City. And I think in the last 2 years, I've also seen, be it lawyers or be it consultant, they are also kind of learning. Nobody actually has an experience of doing offshore vehicle in the Gift City. They have read, understood, discussed, but the actual operating experience and the challenges is yet to come. So I will say the Indian AIF managers, be it Cat 1, 2, 3, they should actually be the early backers in terms of having their offshore vehicle in the Gift City.
On the GST part, well, there's a GST exemption on the management fee, but it is debatable whether it will apply to the carry fee or no. So, what is your view on this?
Yeah, as you rightly said, that there is no clarity in terms of how large the operation should be, and which is why I said, because most of the consultant lawyers helping us understand the whole structure of the gift, even when we ask these type of questions, the clarity don't come in. It depends on who the client we are talking about. For a fund like ours, where we are talking about having an offshore vehicle registered in the Gift City, I think there should not be much requirement in terms of number of people operating out, because it's a vehicle wherein you are pulling the international LPs for your fund. If you are talking about let's say a financial investor who is otherwise investing as an FPI and all, then the rule should be different. So I think it should be looked at what is the end use we are talking about. And if we are talking about something like, if you are trying to replace where there is for today, for example, right, we have a fund in the Netherlands and we invest in India as an FDI route, and we want to be registered in GIFT and continue doing that, that should have a more stricter rule in terms of how many people you want to be there. Because the same rule applies in Netherlands when we are operating out of Netherlands in terms of operations being there, number of people, things like that. So it's the end use that should define, what should be the requirement, and not a single, rule which applies to everybody, irrespective of what is the end objective.
Considering the poem risk, the government really hasn't specified the number of people required to be there in gift. So, how are you structuring that in terms of relocating your people to Gift City?
So far, based on all the understanding we have, after discussion with the lawyers and all, for an offshore vehicle, when we are talking about a Cat 1 AIF kind of structure, there is not a lot of strict requirement in terms of how many people you need to have. I think the requirement is that you need to have an office, physical office space in Gift City. And we see actually a lot of those solutions coming our way from consultants, lawyers, and all, where they give you the entire package in terms of, if people are required, if office is required, if accounting has to be done from there. So that entire package is there. So far, my understanding is for an Cat 1 AIF offshore vehicle operating out of Gift City, there's not a huge requirement in terms of number of people. Mainly, it's in terms of the office space being there, and which can be used as a communication address as well. Which these consultant provides.
How do you think is the operational cost different to a fund manager in gift as compared to other jurisdictions?
So, see, I'll draw a comparison when we were actually working on our first fund in 2018, and we were exploring other jurisdiction apart from Netherlands, and we had several discussions with law firms in Singapore, where just a lawyer fee was $100,000. Just a lawyer fee. I'm not talking about the regulatory fee and all. I'm not talking about the ongoing cost on an annual basis. And when I looked at some of the proposals with respect to Gift City and what is the one-time cost, what is the ongoing cost. So the one-time cost, again, it depends on the size of the fund you are raising, but it can be anywhere between, let's say, 25 to 50 lakh kind of a package I've seen. The operating cost is again dependent on the size of the fund that you are raising, but it's very minimum. They charge around 0.1% of the AUM. So you make a 2% fee and you only pay 0.1 or 0.05% in terms of operating cost. And you compare that with other jurisdiction on the operating cost side. I don't think even the lawyer fee on an ongoing basis will be much higher than the total cost that you can get